They all laughed at the table, and for half a second I wondered if I was the only one who felt the room tilt. If stories like this speak to you, subscribe now. This is part 1, and what happened next changed how I see love, respect, and silence forever. The dinner was supposed to be easy. Sunday, her parents' house, roast chicken drying out in the oven, her sister scrolling on her phone, her dad refilling glasses like it was his job. We'd done this 100 times. I wore the same neutral sweater, said the same polite hellos, smiled when appropriate. I knew the rhythm. I thought I was safe inside it. We sat down, plates clinked. The conversation warmed up the way it always did. Work talk, traffic, someone's neighbor getting a new dog. I answered when spoken to, kept my elbows off the table, did everything a reasonable man does to blend into a family that isn't quite his. Ethan sat beside me, relaxed, confident, already on his second glass of wine. He was in a good mood. I remember thinking that was a good sign. Then his mother asked how things were going at home. It was a soft question, a polite one, the kind meant to keep the evening moving. Ethan didn't even look at me when he answered. "Oh, you know," he said, smiling, "same as always. I make the plans. She agrees with them." There was a pause, just long enough for the words to land. Then laughter. Not cruel laughter, not sharp, the worst kind. Easy laughter, comfortable laughter, the kind that says, "Yes, that sounds right." His sister laughed first. His dad chuckled and shook his head. His mom smiled into her wine glass like she'd heard something familiar. Even the cousin across from us snorted before catching herself. The table filled with the sound of it, a wave rolling over me. I didn't laugh. I didn't frown either. I didn't say a word. I just felt something settle in my chest, quiet and heavy, like a door closing somewhere I didn't know existed. Ethan glanced at me then, just for a second. Not to check if I was hurt, not to apologize, just to see if I'd play along. When I didn't, he raised an eyebrow, amused, and turned back to his family. "Oh, come on," he added lightly. "She knows it's true." That was the moment. Not the joke itself, not the laughter. That sentence. She knows it's true. I looked down at my plate. The chicken had gone cold. I realized I was gripping my fork too tightly, my knuckles pale. I loosened my hand and took a breath. No one noticed. Why would they? To them, this was nothing. A harmless observation, a dynamic they all understood. But inside me, something rewound. I saw every time I'd stayed quiet to keep the peace. Every decision I'd supported because it mattered to him more than it did to me. Every compromise I told myself was just part of marriage. I believed we were a team, that behind closed doors there was respect, even if roles blurred. But at that table, in front of the people whose opinion mattered most to him, he'd reduced me to a punchline. Not angry, not malicious, just honest. The conversation moved on. Someone asked for the salt. Someone told a story about work. Laughter rose and fell again. I nodded when spoken to, chewed when expected, smiled when eyes turned my way. On the outside, nothing had changed. On the inside, I was doing math I'd never done before. Adding moments, subtracting excuses, testing memories against that one sentence to see which one still held. I wondered how long he'd been seeing me this way. I wondered who else saw me like that. I wondered if the respect I thought we shared had ever really existed, or if I'd just been useful, agreeable, convenient. When dinner ended, we helped clear the table. He leaned in and whispered, "You're awfully quiet tonight." Like it was a cute observation. I almost said, "You embarrassed me." I almost said, "That hurt." I almost said, "That hurt." I almost said, "We need to talk." Instead, I smiled and said, "Long week." He nodded, satisfied, already reaching for his coat. As we drove home, the radio played softly between us. He hummed along, tapping the steering wheel. I watched the streetlights pass and felt strangely calm. Not numb. Clear. Because the truth was, nothing had broken at that dinner. Something had finally been revealed. The drive home ended the way most of our drives did, with him pulling into the driveway and reaching for his phone before the engine had fully stopped. He smiled at something on the screen, thumbs moving quickly, attention already elsewhere. I carried the leftovers inside, set them on the counter, and listened to the familiar sounds of our house settling around us. Nothing looked different. That was the strange part. The place where I'd lived for years still smelled like coffee and laundry detergent, still held the quiet promise of routine. But I no longer felt like I belonged to it in the same way. He talked while I unpacked the food, a stream of small complaints and observations. His sister's new haircut, his father's cholesterol, a coworker who didn't pull her weight. I answered when required, short replies, neutral tone. He didn't notice. Or maybe he did notice the not to ask. Either way, the distance between us grew without a sound. That night, lying in bed beside him, I stared at the ceiling long after his breathing slowed into sleep. I replayed the joke again and again, not because it hurt, but because it clarified. It fit too neatly with things I'd ignored. The way he spoke over me when friends were around, the way decisions were already made by the time he asked my opinion, the way he introduced me as easygoing when what he meant was predictable. In the days that followed, I stopped filling the silences. I didn't rush to smooth over awkward moments or agree automatically. I watched instead, and what I saw unsettled me. He was distracted in a way that went beyond stress. His phone never left his side. If I entered a room unexpectedly, he'd angle the screen away without thinking. He started dressing with more care for ordinary errands, leaving the house wearing a confidence he didn't bring back with him. When I asked about his day, his answers grew vague, like summaries written for someone who didn't need details. One evening while he showered, his phone buzzed on the nightstand. I wasn't looking for anything. That's what I told myself. I glanced down out of reflex, the way anyone does when a sound breaks the quiet. The screen lit up with a name I recognized but didn't know well. A woman he'd mentioned casually before. Someone from work. The preview disappeared quickly, but not before I saw the last line. Can't stop thinking about yesterday. I didn't pick up the phone. I didn't open the message. I didn't need to. The feeling that settled over me wasn't panic or rage. It was confirmation. The kind that feels almost merciful after a long stretch of doubt. When he came out of the bathroom, towel around his hair, he was talking again, asking what I wanted for dinner later in the week. As if nothing existed between us but logistics, I told him I wasn't hungry. He shrugged, unbothered, and went back to his phone. From that moment on, I noticed how careful he was with his words and how careless he was with mine. How he remembered details about other people but forgot conversations we'd had days earlier. How he laughed more freely at messages than he did at our table. I started remembering things too. Late nights he said were meetings. Weekends he needed space to think. The way he pulled away from physical closeness, framing it as exhaustion, as if desire was something that simply ran out. At another family gathering a week later, smaller this time, I watched him interact with everyone, confident, sharp, in control. When someone asked how we were doing, he squeezed my arm lightly and said, "We're good." She's very supportive. Supportive. Another word that sounded kind until you understood how it was being used. I smiled for the room. Inside, I was already stepping back, already loosening my grip on a version of us that no longer existed. I didn't confront him. Not yet. I was learning something more important than the details of his betrayal. I was learning how little noise it takes for a marriage to end, when respect leaves first. By the third week after that dinner, the house felt like a place we passed through rather than lived in. Our schedules no longer overlapped by accident. If we shared a room, it was brief, transactional. Coffee and silence. A question about groceries. A reminder about the trash. We moved around each other with the careful politeness of people who no longer expected to be understood. I didn't follow him. I didn't check his messages. I didn't ask questions that would force answers. That surprised me most. The urge to confirm every detail faded once I accepted the shape of the truth. I already knew what mattered. He had stepped outside the marriage long before he stepped outside our house. What changed was me. I stopped adjusting my tone to keep him comfortable. When he asked my opinion, I gave it plainly, without softening the edges. When I disagreed, I didn't smile to make it easier. And he noticed, not right away, but enough to comment on it one evening while we ate takeout on opposite ends of the couch. "You've been different," he said, eyes still on the screen. Did I do something? The question wasn't curiosity. It was irritation disguised as concern. I took a breath. Do you want the honest answer or the easy one? He looked at me then, really looked, as if seeing me clearly required effort. What's that supposed to mean? It means I'm tired of pretending I don't hear things, I said. I'm tired of laughing when something isn't funny. He frowned. Is this about that dinner? You're still on that. Still on that. As if a sentence spoken in front of his family was a phase I'd failed to grow out of. It showed me something, I said carefully. What? He asked. That I made a joke? Everyone jokes. I nodded. That wasn't a joke. That was how you see me. He scoffed, turning away. You're being dramatic. There it was. The word he used whenever my feelings interrupted his narrative. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't list examples. I didn't mention the message I'd seen, the changes I'd noticed, the distance he pretended was normal. I just said, if that's what you think, then you're not listening. He laughed once, sharp and humorless. I listen plenty. You just don't like what you're hearing. That night, he slept facing the other side of the bed. In the morning, he left early without saying goodbye. A few days later, I ran into his coworker at a coffee shop near our house. It was unplanned, the kind of coincidence that feels staged even when it isn't. She looked surprised to see me, then overly friendly, asking how I was, how things were at home. She talked too much. That was her mistake. You're lucky, she said with a grin. He's incredible, really driven. I studied her face, the confidence, the comfort. You work late together a lot, I asked. She hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. Sometimes long enough, she said. Deadlines, you know. I smiled. Of course. I walked out before she could say anything else. Outside, the air felt sharper, cleaner. There was no confrontation, no dramatic reveal, just another piece fitting neatly into place. That evening, when he came home, I told him I'd made a decision. His shoulders tensed immediately. About what? About me, I said. About what I'm willing to be in this marriage. He crossed his arms, defensive now. You're scaring me. I'm not angry, I said. I'm clear. I told him I wouldn't stay in a relationship where I was spoken about like an accessory and treated like an afterthought. I didn't accuse him of anything. I didn't need to. The silence between us did the work. He looked at me for a long time, searching for something he wasn't finding. Control. Guilt. Familiarity. So what? He said finally. You're just going to leave? I'm going to stop disappearing, I answered. He didn't cry. He didn't apologize. He said, finally, you're just going to leave. I'm going to stop disappearing, I answered. He didn't cry. He didn't apologize. He said, you're overreacting. One last time. Like a spell he'd always trusted to work, but this time it didn't. I went to bed alone. Not because he wasn't there, but because I finally was. The morning I packed my things, the house was quiet in a way it had never been before. Not empty, just honest. Sunlight came through the blinds and fell across the floor like it always had. But for the first time, I wasn't trying to fit myself into the shape of the room. I moved slowly, deliberately, choosing what to take and what to leave behind. Not because I was unsure, but because I was finished rushing for someone who never waited for me. He watched from the doorway at first, arms folded, saying nothing. When it became clear I wasn't performing a dramatic exit, he stepped into the room. So, this is really happening, he said. Yes, I replied. He shook his head, almost amused. You're throwing everything away over one comment. I zipped the bag and met his eyes. No, I finally heard what you've been saying for years. He opened his mouth, then closed it. For the first time since that dinner, he looked uncertain, not remorseful, just unsure which version of me he was dealing with. A week later, we sat across from each other in a neutral office with beige walls and a clock that ticks too loudly. Papers were signed, words like "unapplicable" and "straightforward" were used, as if they could smooth the reality of what was ending. He was composed, professional, already planning the next chapter. I recognized that look. I'd seen it on his face when he talked about work, about goals, about anything that didn't require vulnerability. When it was over, he stood, adjusted his jacket, and said, I hope you find what you're looking for. I nodded. I already did. In the months that followed, people asked questions in careful ways. Friends took sides without admitting it. Family members offered advice I didn't ask for. I answered politely and kept my explanation simple. The truth didn't need decoration. The marriage didn't end with a fight or a scandal. It ended with clarity. I heard through others that he moved on quickly, that he told the story differently, as people often do, that I'd been distant, that I'd changed. In a way, he was right. I had changed. I'd stopped accepting versions of myself that were easier for others to manage. One evening, I ran into him again by chance. A grocery store aisle, an awkward pause. He smiled, practiced and thin. "You look good," he said. "So do you," I replied, and meant it. There was a moment then, a quiet one, where he seemed to wait for something. Regret, maybe. Validation, a reaction. I gave him none. As I walked away, I realized something that had taken me years to learn. Betrayal doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it comes disguised as humor, as familiarity, as a joke everyone else laughs at. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stop laughing along. As the author of this story, I'll leave you with this. Pay attention to how someone speaks about you when they think it doesn't matter. Respect rarely disappears overnight. It erodes in small, excusable moments. If you recognize yourself in this story, remember that silence is not peace, and endurance is not love. Choosing yourself is not failure. It is the beginning of a life that doesn't require you to shrink. If this story resonated with you, subscribe for more real human stories about relationships, self-respect, and the moments that quietly change everything.